My number one use of this book has been making questionable choices of who I date based on how much they know about it. Also killing bugs. Good morning, good evening, good to who needs it. So, I wanted to give you the quick warning that this video was made over the course of months because it was my practice video for when I was learning different transitions and things in video editing. So if it looks weird, that's why. This is kind of a zhuzhed up practice test, but I wanted to put it out there anyway because I think it's cool. So, thanks for watching. There is scandal around Shakespeare, but why? Okay, so stop. Which scandal am I even talking about? There are so many scandals around Shakespeare. It almost depends on what time period you're talking about. Initial scandals around Shakespeare contemporary to his lifetime were that he was crass, bawdy, too centered on the lives of, well, peasants. The same sort of accusations that would be famously thrown at Mozart's operas almost 200 years later. Every old thing that lasts used to be radical. So, for my first trick, why are there so many of Shakespeare's famous plays not set in England? Apart from the histories, few of Shakespeare's stories take place in England. At the time, being educated meant speaking Latin. And I'm going to illustrate this by teaching you the etymology of the word. Now, there's some debate about the origin of. There is a Germanic root, and in most Germanic languages, there are some variations of. The Proto-German is kunto, and the Norse was kunta. Its first written use in English goes back to the Oxford Dictionary in 1230 as part of a place name. In the German fashion, it is generally used as a reference to genitalia, body parts, especially female, or conveying an orifice. Now this seems like a pretty clear-cut word origin, but this is English, so we have to make everything about Latin because that proves just how smart we are. So there's the theory put forward that it comes from the word cunere, which means to wedge. Just wedge it on in there. That's stupid. Regardless, the term wasn't offensive from 1230 until the 1800s. Ben Jonson, who we're going to be talking about in a bit, has his own famous burn scarred into the English language because of the Latinization of English. John Dryden, poet, critic, hater of Ben Jonson, wrote of Ben Jonson in 1672, "The preposition at the end of the sentence, a common fault with him." It's a quip and an insult. This is the first time that such a rule is discussed in the English language, and we know it to the date, participants, and quotation. We know that it comes from a rivalry between writers. We know what the actual intent behind the sentence is. What Dryden is implying by saying that a person has the fault of putting a preposition at the end of a sentence is that the person, Jonson, does not speak Latin. In Latin, you literally cannot end a sentence in a preposition because of the structure. And if you cannot try to emulate Latin in a Germanic language, it is either because you do not have the skill nor discipline, you lazy bitch. Setting stories in Italy would be drawing on the Roman Empire and its scattered influence in England. Technically, the empire ended in 330 AD, shifting the capital from Rome to Constantinople and losing England as a territory in the transition. England in the 1500s was full of decaying Roman landmarks, easily found Roman artifacts, and all of this lingering Roman impact on society. One of Shakespeare's first works, Titus Andronicus, is a straight-up Roman story of blood and vengeance steeped in Mediterranean cultural touchstones. I don't think I need to explain what Julius Caesar was. The fixation on Rome isn't just fetishizing. Rome was kind of magical to England, a buried but visible part of its own past, yet removed, something distinctly other. It's no surprise that Midsummer Night's Dream is a fairy story, that Merchant of Venice feels so removed. This was a setting that didn't quite feel real at the time. Anyway, why was this a scandal? Nationalism! Even Hamlet was in Denmark. It's so frequently mistaken to be taken place in England because people don't want to think of it that way. Anyway, to avoid being called unpatriotic, Shakespeare wrote the histories. Shakespeare's plays are grouped into three categories: comedies, histories, and tragedies. The histories, in many ways, define what historical fiction is today. They include the standalone plays like King John, Edward III, Henry VIII. There is also the first tetralogy about the War of the Roses saga, and that includes Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. The second tetralogy was Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V, which is frequently called the Henriade after its protagonist, Prince Hal. If you saw that Timothée Chalamet Netflix movie, The King, that was Prince Hal. More of a Falstaff guy. But this attempt to avoid unpatriotic scandal leads to another question. Is Shakespeare actually the Queen of England? This is insane. The Shakespeare Authorship question, as it's called, is actually not contemporary to Shakespeare. People at the time believed Shakespeare to be Shakespeare, with a casket and an epigraph and everything. But the Shakespeare authorship question does draw on scandals which were contemporary to Shakespeare, especially concerning the publication of the first folio after his death. My first pass at making this video was actually talking about the anatomy and history of bookmaking, and even went into a nice rant on Nicholas Flamel, who we can talk about some other day. But it is impossible to discuss the history of print without delving into the weirdness that is Shakespeare's first folio. Shakespeare's first folio is the subject of the Oxford theory, the theory that Shakespeare was actually a pseudonym for Lord Oxford. There are many theories about Shakespeare's real identity, including that his real identity was William Shakespeare. But here's some of the reasons why the first folio is so controversial, and has been controversial since its first publication in 1623. Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, commonly referred to as the First Folio, was a collection of Shakespeare's plays, including several that had never been formally published. Without the First Folio's publication, there would be many plays missing from the canon, including Macbeth and Twelfth Night. Considered one of the most influential books ever published, it's unique for a lot of reasons. The First Folio was a statement piece intended to emphasize the importance of Shakespeare to English literature. The first clue that something is off about it, however, is that famous portrait of Shakespeare in the folio's beginning. The portrait is done by Martin Droeshout, a Flemish engraver, and the first issue some scholars have with it is the somewhat grotesque depiction of Shakespeare. Many have argued that maybe Droeshout just wasn't very good. Now that could just be mean, the guy could have been ugly, though the portrait isn't terribly out of Droeshout's style, so this point is a matter of preference and debate. Another issue people have with the Droeshout portrait is that it doesn't fit the way in which artists or playwrights of the time were depicted. This is something for larger discussion about the nature of books as its cultural shorthand. Writers and authors of the time were often depicted with certain classical markings to indicate their profession, commonly laurel leaves hearkening to Apollo. And here's a portrait of Ben Jonson with laurel leaves, alluding to more that we're going to have to say about Mr. Johnson in a moment. But because of these discrepancies, the Shakespeare portrait has often been described as unambitious and odd. Odd especially because if the purpose of the First Folio is to collect and memorialize Shakespeare as being of great importance to literature, why go through the trouble of creating and including an unusually plain portrait with no indication of who the person is? And it's an enormous portrait. It takes up a whole page. Parallel to the portrait is a poem by Ben Jonson to the reader, urging people not to look at the portrait. This figure that thou here feast put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the grower had a knife, with knower to outdo the life. Oh, could he but have drawn his wit, and well and fast he hath hit, his face this print would then surpass all that were error in face. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. It's thought by conspiracy theorists that whoever Shakespeare was, Ben Jonson was clearly in on the joke. Remember too that Shakespeare's grave also had a similarly weird epitaph. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. First of all, metal, very sexy of him. I would love to put a curse on my tombstone, but it admittedly doesn't help the argument that maybe there's something or someone else in there, when everything about Shakespeare made by people who knew and loved him includes a "don't ask about Shakespeare, just look at the books" clause. John Hemmings and Henry Condell, who take credit for compiling the folio, were actors of the King's Men, the company which Shakespeare wrote and acted for, and the first folio is remarkable for including not only this massive undertaking of compiled works, but it also painstakingly and lovingly lists the actors in each of the original productions, giving credit not only to Shakespeare, but to the troupe that brought these plays to life. Isaac Jaggard and Edward Blount, given credit as the booksellers responsible for its final publication, also kind of represent an odd choice. William Jaggard, Isaac's father, who worked with him, is often credited but not by name. It was considered by many contemporaries as bizarre that the King's Men would have chosen William Jaggard to be associated with the first folio, even if it was his son given final credit for the work, because William had been involved in a scandal, sometimes called the False Folio, where he had been discovered during Shakespeare's lifetime, misattributing works to Shakespeare, including plagiarizing writer Thomas Heywood, and William had also published Shakespeare's quartos in the past with no clear publishing rights secured by the author, for which Shakespeare supposedly hated the man. So another unusual shadow on the folio falls. Part of this account comes from Thomas Heywood himself, which brings up an interesting point. The majority of things we know about Shakespeare come from other writers and are collaborated by other writers, but nothing from the people who knew Shakespeare personally. The King's Men don't do, well, Shakespeare said, but other writers of the time like to say, well, Shakespeare said, usually in the process of making themselves sound good. Thomas Heywood's claim that Shakespeare hated Jaggard because Jaggard mistakenly published Heywood as Shakespeare doesn't really jive with Shakespeare's closest associates trusting Jaggard with the first folio. Many other authors of this time seem to use Shakespeare as a name drop, leading some to theorize that Shakespeare is perhaps a guild code word like Alan Smithy, a pseudonym used by a group of performers and writers as an industry in reference. Or, hear me out, Shakespeare was just some guy. There are a lot of theories, there's a lot of conspiracies, a lot of whys. There's some interesting things about revisionist history and changes to statues and epitaphs of people associated with Shakespeare after his death, of other figures like Ben Jonson and Lord Oxford maybe having some shady involvement in the publication of these books. So what does it all mean? The First Folio is one of the most scrutinized books in history. Does it really matter if Shakespeare was Shakespeare or a group of writers or a group of actors even? Well, yes and no. You could do as Ben Jonson urges and just look at what really matters, the plays. But I'd argue that it's also really important, and that the King's Men, Condell and Hemmings, believed it was crucial, that it wasn't just Shakespeare's name, it was the actors, the stagehands, the group. Shakespeare didn't accomplish anything alone. The First Folio wasn't even published in his lifetime, and it doesn't just commemorate Shakespeare, it commemorates all of them. He was dead. The folio is the work of other men trying to have these plays preserved. So yes, it's the plays, but it's inspiring just how many people had to come together to bring them to us. For more information on this topic, sources, and other content, please look at the associated blog post on aliactus.com. That's aliactast.com. The blog updates with weekly book reviews and essays on Saturdays. If you liked this, like it and share whatever you feel you gotta do. There are monthly video essays the last week of every month and a plethora of random shit in between. Thank you so much for listening.